When most people imagine warriors of the Middle Ages, they picture armored knights on horseback, or peasants with simple spears. But the battlefield was far more diverse, filled with specialized fighters who rarely get the spotlight. In this video, we'll uncover 5 medieval warrior classes you've probably never heard of. Figures who shaped the way wars were fought and left a mark on history, even if their names don't appear in the usual tales. Number 1. Housecarls. Picture a king's inner circle of professional infantry full-time retainers who slept near the royal hall, ate at the lord's table, and marched at a moment's notice. That was the housecarl, a salaried, oath-bound warrior whose job blended bodyguard duty with frontline shock combat. Unlike part-time levies, these men trained year-round and lived from war pay, gift-giving, and grants of gear or land. Their oath was personal and specific: keep the lord safe, stand fast in battle, and maintain discipline even when militia lines buckled. In return came steady wages, food, winter quarters, and prestige that set them above ordinary freemen, but just under the great landholding elite. Equipment tells you how they fought. A typical housecarl wore a long mail hauberk with a coif or separate hood, a conical helmet with a nasal bar, and a sturdy gambeson beneath. The shield was often the kite type, good for protecting the legs in dense infantry work, and the sidearm a pattern-welded sword or seax. But the signature tool was the long-hafted Dane axe, a two-handed bearded blade that could shear shield rims, maim horses, and punch through mail when swung in coordinated volleys. In tight formations, they layered defense and offense. The front rank braced shields and short weapons. The second rank timed axe strokes over the top, turning the line into a flexible cutting machine. Their battlefield value rested on cohesion. Housecarls drilled to keep spacing, rotate the wounded to the rear, and read the banner's signals. They were used to anchor a shield wall on key terrain ridges, ditch lines, or the edge of a wood places that disrupted enemy cavalry, and funneled attacks into kill zones. When a breach loomed, small files of housecarls counterpunched, buying time for the wider line to reform. In set-piece encounters of the mid-11th century, they were the difference between a levy that merely showed up and an army that could actually hold ground against disciplined horse or missile fire. Their role wasn't just battle day. On campaign, housecarls policed foragers, guarded siege trains, and enforced order at river crossings, where a panicked crowd could doom an army. In peacetime, they trained with the lord's retainers, inspected spears and arrows for the seasonal levy, and served as tax escorts when silver had to move along exposed roads. Law codes placed them high in the social price lists. If one fell, the compensation was steep, because losing a trained guardian weakened both the court and the countryside. Recruitment drew from several streams: seasoned warriors from the north who sought steady pay, ambitious locals aiming to climb, and veterans from coastal fleets who already knew strict discipline. Advancement was realistic. A capable housecarl might receive a ring, a fine horse, or a small estate to support his gear. Some veterans later shifted into mounted service or managerial roles, overseeing armories, drilling household men, or commanding detachments at royal sites. After the political upheavals of the late 11th century, a portion adapted to new overlords, while others sought employment abroad where professional infantry were prized. What stayed constant was the template they embodied: salaried, kit-heavy, oath-tight soldiers who made early medieval armies more than crowds with spears. Wherever a ruler needed a wall that would not break, he put housecarls there, and expected them to stand until the banner fell, or the enemy did. Number 2. Longbowmen. Among the less glamorous but profoundly influential classes of medieval warriors were the longbowmen, men whose power did not come from heavy armor or charging horses, but from the disciplined use of a single weapon. The longbow was not just a larger version of a hunting bow. It required extraordinary strength and years of practice to master. Draw weights on surviving examples often reach between 100 and 160 pounds, far beyond what an untrained soldier could handle. Because of this, boys started training from an early age, building the muscular endurance needed to loose arrow after arrow for extended periods. Archaeological studies of skeletal remains even show deformations in the arms and shoulders of lifelong archers, evidence of the physical toll their skill demanded. The effectiveness of the longbow lay in its combination of range, rate of fire, and penetration. A skilled archer could send between 10 and 12 arrows into the air each minute, creating deadly volleys that disrupted cavalry charges and broke the cohesion of infantry formations. Contemporary accounts describe battlefields where shafts darkened the sky, with arrows falling like a storm onto advancing troops. Mail hauberks and even early plate could be pierced at closer distances, and horses often fell before riders even reached contact. Against enemies who relied heavily on shock cavalry, this tactic shifted the balance of power, proving that disciplined infantry with ranged weapons could blunt elite mounted troops. Logistics were crucial to making this work. Armies needed tens of thousands of arrows prepared in advance, bundled and transported with care. Fletchers worked constantly to produce standardized shafts, while bowyers selected yew wood, carefully seasoned to achieve both power and flexibility. Each archer carried a sheaf of arrows, but relied on supply trains to maintain fire throughout long campaigns. This level of organization shows how the longbow was not just a weapon, but part of a broader military system that required planning, industry, and state support. Beyond the battlefield, longbowmen had a social and cultural role. Their training was embedded into law codes that required regular practice on village greens, turning archery into both a civic duty and a communal event. This fostered a pool of capable fighters who could be called upon in wartime, blending the line between professional soldier and armed freeman. Unlike heavily armored knights, these men represented a different kind of martial power, one rooted in collective discipline and technical skill rather than individual wealth or noble lineage. Their legacy reshaped military thinking, demonstrating that massed missile troops could decide engagements, alter strategies, and force even the most prestigious warriors to adapt or fall. Number 3. Hobelars. Hobelars were a distinctive class of medieval light cavalry, whose role was shaped less by chivalric ideals and more by the practical demands of rough terrain, rapid movement, and constant skirmishing. Unlike heavily armored knights, who relied on large war horses bred for shock charges, Hobelars rode smaller, more agile horses, often referred to as hobbies. These mounts were not suited for crashing into a wall of infantry, but were perfect for traversing uneven ground, crossing rivers, and sustaining long-distance raids. The men who rode them were lightly equipped compared to knights, usually wearing a padded gambeson, sometimes reinforced with mail, and carrying a mix of weapons such as spears, swords, and occasionally javelins. Their lighter kit meant greater speed and endurance, qualities that proved invaluable in regions where ambushes, quick raids, and hit-and-run tactics were more effective than formal set-piece battles. What makes Hobelars so interesting is how they filled a gap in medieval warfare that neither knights nor infantry could cover efficiently. Heavily armed cavalry was devastating on open fields, but expensive to maintain and vulnerable in bogs, hills, or forests. Infantry levies were numerous, but slow and poorly trained for mobile warfare. Hobelars bridged this divide, serving as scouts, raiders, and pursuit troops. They could harass enemy supply lines, shadow armies to report movements, and chase down retreating foes who escaped the slower infantry. In some campaigns, their speed and ability to cover long distances made them ideal for surprise attacks on outposts and convoys, weakening an opponent before a major clash even occurred. The social makeup of Hobelars also differed from the knightly class. While knights came from wealthy backgrounds capable of affording expensive armor and horses, Hobelars often came from lower-ranking free men or minor landholders who could maintain the lighter and cheaper hobby horse. This allowed lords and kings to field more mounted troops at a fraction of the cost, extending their military reach without straining resources as heavily as supporting a full corps of knights. Over time, the value of Hobelars was recognized to such an extent that they were frequently recruited into royal armies as a permanent component rather than as an irregular force. Their prominence rose especially during conflicts marked by constant raids, sieges, and mobile warfare. In these contexts, Hobelars demonstrated that flexibility and adaptability could be just as decisive as heavy armor and noble lineage. While knights captured the imagination of chroniclers and poets, Hobelars quietly provided the backbone of reconnaissance, raiding, and pursuit operations that often determined whether campaigns succeeded or failed. They reveal a side of medieval military organization that depended less on spectacle and more on efficiency, showing how armies adjusted to geography, economy, and the realities of prolonged conflict. Number 4. Billmen. Billmen were one of the most characteristic, yet often overlooked infantry types of the later Middle Ages, representing a shift away from reliance on swords and spears toward polearms that combined versatility with sheer stopping power. The weapon they carried, the bill or billhook, was originally an agricultural tool adapted for war. With its hooked blade, spike, and sometimes additional cutting edges, it was capable of pulling riders from their saddles, piercing armor, and hacking through shields. Unlike a simple spear that relied mainly on thrusting, the bill allowed multiple techniques: thrust, chop, hook, and sweep. This adaptability meant a line of billmen could face both cavalry and infantry, holding ground with discipline while delivering deadly counterstrikes. Their tactical value increased as warfare changed. Heavy cavalry, once dominant, began losing its edge against disciplined infantry formations supported by missile troops. Billmen fit neatly into this system, providing a solid core for armies that needed affordable but effective foot soldiers. They often fought in combination with longbowmen, forming a partnership where arrows disrupted enemy advances and billmen finished the job at close quarters. On the battlefield, they typically stood in tight ranks, bracing their polearms in defense against charging horses, and then pressing forward when the moment came to break the enemy line. The sight of hooked blades flashing in unison was intimidating, especially for cavalrymen who knew a single pull could drag them down into the crush of foot soldiers. Equipment among billmen varied depending on wealth and availability, but many wore padded jacks reinforced with small metal plates or lighter mail that offered flexibility without the cost of full armor. Helmets ranged from simple steel caps to more protective sallets, and some carried small bucklers or daggers as backup weapons. This made them lighter and more mobile than heavily armored elites, though still resilient enough to stand in protracted melee. The balance between affordability and effectiveness ensured that billmen became a staple of armies in the later medieval centuries. Their importance also reflected broader social and military trends. As central authorities sought more reliable forces than seasonal levies, billmen provided a dependable backbone of trained infantry. They could be drawn from the ranks of yeomen and freemen who had the resources to equip themselves with proper gear, making them different from the poorest conscripts who carried little more than a spear. This gave them a status somewhere between militia and professionals, a practical solution for lords who needed strong infantry without the expense of maintaining large numbers of knights. Over time, billmen became emblematic of a pragmatic approach to war, one that valued disciplined formations and versatile weapons over aristocratic ideals. Their enduring presence shows how medieval armies were constantly adapting, and how innovation could come from the simplest of tools reshaped for the demands of battle. Number 5. Yeomen. Yeomen occupied a unique space within medieval society and warfare, forming a class of warriors whose strength came not from noble titles or wealth, but from land ownership, personal skill, and disciplined participation in local defense. Unlike peasants tied to the soil, or aristocrats who trained for mounted combat, yeomen were freeholders, men who had enough property to sustain themselves and equip for war without relying entirely on a lord's patronage. This independence gave them both responsibility and pride, shaping a culture where military service was expected but also seen as proof of status. The most recognizable contribution of yeomen was their role as archers, trained from boyhood in the use of the longbow. Regular practice was not a pastime, but a requirement, embedded in local customs and legal obligations that mandated archery training on holidays and at community gatherings. Over time, this constant preparation created a population of men who could draw war bows with impressive strength, producing a force of missile troops unlike anything most European armies could field. Their skill allowed commanders to rely on a broad base of trained archers rather than depending solely on small numbers of professionals. Yet yeomen were more than bowmen. In some campaigns, they served as billmen or spearmen, filling infantry ranks that needed reliability and cohesion. Their economic position meant they could afford better equipment than the poorest levy's sturdy bows, reinforced jacks of plate, helmets, and sidearms that allowed them to fight at close range when required. This flexibility made them a valuable pool of manpower, disciplined enough to maintain formation, strong enough to sustain prolonged campaigns, and loyal enough to defend their communities when danger threatened. Socially, yeomen represented an important middle layer. They were not nobles, yet they were not powerless peasants either. Their landholdings gave them a voice in local administration, and their service in war earned them recognition from higher lords. Over time, their identity was reinforced through customs, traditions, and even literature, where the figure of the independent archer or small landholder appeared as a symbol of resilience and local pride. In many ways, yeomen illustrate how military roles were tied directly to social structures. The ability to fight was linked to economic independence, and the responsibility to defend the realm was spread broadly among those with the means to equip themselves. Their significance lies in the way they balanced professional skill with civic duty. Yeomen demonstrate that medieval armies were not composed solely of knights and mercenaries, but also of disciplined free men, whose steady presence gave resilience to armies and continuity to military culture. They were proof that effective warfare relied on a broad foundation of trained commoners, making them a warrior class that deserves far more recognition than the chronicles usually grant.